America's war in Afghanistan is the longest war in the history of the United States. Today's guest served on the staff of the U.S. ambassador there in the years after 9/11, and she argues now that the role of the American press in Afghanistan is essential to understanding the conduct of the war. She's Katherine A. Brown this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. To do that, we sit down every week with the best storytellers around, filmmakers, authors, journalists, and more, to make sense of the big stories that shape public life in the United States today. To help us this week, we're joined by Katherine Brown, the author of a compelling new book about the press and America's war in Afghanistan. Your Country, Our War. Katherine, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Ludis.
So, now that's special. So let's go back to the autumn of 2003. You're a 25-year-old press aide in Kabul, Afghanistan. How did you get there?
I was lucky. I had the good fortune of working for the National Security Advisor at the time, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice and Steve Hadley, and was really eager to get out into the field and see the effects of American foreign policies post 9/11. Got the opportunity from the outgoing ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad, to go and be a press aide at the embassy in Kabul. Jumped at it, and that began about 13 years of work and research and study of the place.
What was the experience like when you were working in Afghanistan?
I loved it. I quickly became enamored with the Afghan people, with their story, their struggle for peace, with the beauty of the place. I think that, I say in the book that they'd never seen a place before that had combined such beauty with such tragedy, and that it was very compelling to me. And I think that if you speak to most Americans or Westerners who spent time in Afghanistan as aid workers, as diplomats, or even as soldiers who fought there, they'll tell you that there's something inherently special about the place.
Had you studied Afghanistan or learned about it before you went there, or was this sort of serendipitous, for lack of a better word?
Totally new to me. I had studied, like most international relations students in the 90s, was really taken with Cold War studies and in Europe. And then I worked a lot in Asia for a nonprofit I worked for out of college before I got to Kabul, but never South Asia, never Afghanistan. So it was completely new to me.
Did you fly in the first time, or did you travel by? I'm assuming you flew in.
I flew in.
So what do you bring us back there, because this is pretty remarkable. What are you thinking as you're flying in?
It was an overwhelming flight. It was Thanksgiving Day 2003, and I was flying in with the U.S. ambassador at the time, who was arriving as U.S. ambassador for the first time, Zalmay Khalilzad, and also Lieutenant General David Barno, who is the commanding general of U.S. Armed Forces, and a few other colleagues like Marin Stremecki, who was with me, and we were on a C-130. So we picked it up in Germany and at Ramstein Air Force Base, and then we flew to Bagram Air Force Base. And so
it's a long flight.
It was a long flight.
That's a long
very
flight.
Uncomfortable.
On a C-130, which is not a luxury jetliner, shall we say?
Yeah, it was not, and there was armored tractors, inside the plane, and I remember looking outside of the windows and just being taken with how stunningly beautiful the mountains were. It reminded me a lot of Colorado, where I started college. And so,
what's that moment like? So you're young, you're going into a war zone. What is sort of thought process going through your head? What do you tell your family when you say, I'm gonna go work in Kabul?
I think I just was very determined to go. So there was really no kind of questioning it. I think the minute I got asked to go, I knew I was going to. So I think my family's went along with it. They've always been very supportive.
So the title of the book, Your Country, Our War, it's evocative. Now you did something creative on the cover too, because you've got both Pashto and Dari script on the cover, but you changed the translation.
I changed the translation, and if you don't read Pashto or Dari, you have no idea. But the title came from the general idea that if you're an American, or if your native language is English and you hear the word Afghanistan, you think war. If you hear the word Afghanistan and you speak Dari or Pashto, two of the most dominant languages in Afghanistan, you think it's your country. So it's those two conflicting frames and the tension that it creates that I unpack in the book. And so we thought it would be clever to change the meaning of the book and the title. So if you're reading it in Dari or Pashto, it says, your war, our country. It reverses the meaning, and that's intentional.
That's creative. It's clever.
Thank you. It wasn't.
What's the reaction been? I mean, to the American reading audience?
To Americans, they see the Dari Pashto, and it's actually the script is quite beautiful. So it also offers some cover art. But if you're reading it and those are your native tongues, the immediate thing that you think is that the translation was wrong, and might take it a few steps further to think, well, another Westerner who's parachuted into our country and doesn't even bother to get the translation right. So it's given new meaning to what the book is really about, which is exactly this concept of Westerners and particularly Americans trying to make sense of this country.
So what is sort of the overriding story? And I realize we could talk for hours about this. The overriding story that the American press gives the American public and the world about Afghanistan, which is really the grand theme of your book.
Yeah.
What is that story?
It's very similar to the way that American elite journalism writes about the rest of the world. It's first of all very much focused on America at the center, the U.S. It's very U.S.-centric. And this is mostly because they're appealing to American audiences primarily. They want to tell a story of the world that resonates with them. Also, stories normally reflect American values, or there's enduring values of American news in the sense that they put human rights first in particular, or they're cherishing liberal democratic values that also makes sense to American audiences. And the third part is almost that there is it's almost America's responsibility to as a superpower, to underwrite global security, and it's America's responsibility to make sure that foreign aid is distributed equitably and to ensure that American foreign policies are effective. So that kind of thinking, drives coverage. For Afghanistan, what that means is that there's really about two frames that in which you encounter Afghanistan as a reader. It's usually about the war. It's the country is reduced into this tight security frame. Or it's about Afghanistan, the failed state, and it focuses on corruption and other issues that have really, just challenged the Afghan elites in building a liberal democracy.
There's been a lot of violence, though, in Afghanistan, so it's sort of hard. I don't want to say hard, maybe that's not the right word. You can't separate that, though, from the story of Afghanistan. What has happened there, the numbers of people who have died and been killed on all sides, and the manner in which they have died and been killed. How does that fit into sort of this larger narrative? That's a story that has to be told, too.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that when you're reading about it as an American or a Westerner, of course, that's what you think of with the country, and that violence has driven much of its history, much of its identity. The tension that surfaces is that when you are of that country, you don't essentially see it that way, and I think that's hard for us to imagine because our experience with the country is born of 9/11, or before that it was born from the Cold War, and we very much associate the country with violence and with billions of dollars of American dollars being sent there, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans who've fought there, worked there. And so it's difficult for us to disassociate Afghanistan from violence. if you are Afghan and you're of the country, that's not necessarily how you would narrow down your country. It's a three-dimensional place with three-dimensional people, and the frustration comes when that multidimensional view is constricted and narrowed for the purpose of Americans.
Well, and you sort of got an earful about that from the former president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, absolutely. I first met President Karzai, and it was a casual encounter. It wasn't as if he would remember who I was. But when I was a press aide, and it was December 2003, the story of Afghanistan at the time was pretty good. There was a hopeful time for the country. The U.S. media attention had shifted to Iraq. And there was a few print journalists, American and Western print journalists, dedicated to the Afghanistan story, but not a lot of broadcast journalists who were focused on the country at the time. And Afghanistan was undergoing a historic process called the Constitutional Legislature. They were building their first democratic constitution in its history. And I was at the State Department. We wanted to share this good news story, my colleagues, and made it so that we had a satellite feed so that President Karzai could do interviews with some of American news anchors about this process and talk about how historic, what a great milestone this was for the country, and also a great milestone for U.S. foreign policy. And Hamid Karzai came in to do the interview with Tom Brokaw. It was a really easy interview. He, at the time, was really embraced as this elegant figure, this hopeful figure, this very credible partner, this hero. Yeah. And he had this very easy interview. And soon after, a few years after, the media depiction of him shifted, right? We weren't quite sure if he was a credible partner anymore. And his view of the American press, shifted in kind. He very much felt as if the American press the journalists were agents of the U.S. government, that they sought really to support and advance U.S. foreign policy, and that foreign policy was really to undermine the country's stability so that it could stay there forever and really undermine his role. He strongly felt by the time he left office that the U.S. press were out to undermine him. And so to finish this book about 2.5 years ago, I went to see him. And to your point, we had this interview about these beliefs that he has, and which led him to kick out a New York Times reporter, Matt Rosenberg, as one of his last acts in office. And as I was leaving, I said to him that I really value the country, that I felt really endeared to the people, and that a lot of Americans who spent time there feel the same way, and that we think of our time in the country quite fondly. And he was really, really struck by that and said, but what about everyday Americans? What do they think about us? Do they see us in this light, or do they just believe that we're a conflict-ridden, failed state? Because your American press has done that to us. So you could tell that he was very, very impacted by the American narrative.
Is there validity to his critique?
There is. There is. There is and there is not, right? There is very much that the American press and Western press as well, the British press, you can say Australian, you can say European press have really focused on the conflict because that's where their dollars and their troops, have been invested in. And so if you read the news, you don't really see the life, you don't see the country in three dimension that he was talking about and that he wished other people around the world would see. That he's right that the Western press does have this power in the same way that the American power is material. The American press also has power in really fixing identity and fixing images around the world, and that can affect how international politics is convened. So he was right about the power. He was not right about the U.S. journalists being agents for the U.S. government. The relationship between reporters and officials for the U.S. is really mired in a state of distrust.
Let me just sort of push this a little bit further. So when he says that the general criticism that this one-dimensional portrayal of life in Afghanistan, is his reaction to it from a sense of pride and love for his country and the beauty that you saw and you witnessed in it, or is he concerned that that distortion is also shaping the policy choices that American policymakers are grappling with?
It's both. I think if you are an Afghan and you're reading about yourself through the view of the United States, there's something displacing about it. It's the same for us. If you ever read about the United States in a foreign newspaper, there's something displacing, there's something disorienting. It's kind of like when you talk about your family or you hear someone else talk about your family. There is that certain sense of pride. There's a sense of nationalism that stirs within you, a sense of frustration that whomever is the authority on your identity doesn't really know what they're talking about. So there's that at its core, very much so. But also, if you are a leader of the country, you're very much aware of the power that Western news has in shaping the normative environment in which decisions are made about your country.
I think your critique about American press coverage of Afghanistan, excuse me, is spot on. I would say, however, that there's an element to it that we see in our own reporting of our own events in the U.S. We've talked about this more than once on the show, and it's the old mantra, the old television broadcast saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Mm-hmm. There's a tendency to go, and particularly now in a day and an age when so much of news coverage, whether it's broadcast or print or whatever, is driven by advertising, which relies on clicks, which we all measure through algorithms and so forth and so on. The story, the explosion, the murder, the rape, that gets more views. I mean, that is just what happens, literally what happens. And the so-called good news, which, good newspapers and media outlets also try to report, gets far less attention. I think that's a function of human behavior.
Absolutely.
Or the way the human brain is wired. But I'm being very long-winded here, and I'll mercifully cut this short right now. But I think that's part of this as well. It wasn't simply a bias against Afghanistan or the Afghan people. It was the way we write things.
No, you're absolutely right. What the book does is it looks at the sociological constraints that foreign correspondents have. It isn't really meant to be so much a criticism on them as it is the larger structures that govern our news, right? It's market driven. You are writing for certain audiences. You are more likely to get attention if there's bad news than good news. That's just a universal, timeless truth with news. The foreign correspondents, when you speak with them, they're under immense pressure to summarize a country, a place, a history, a people in a really tight frame with very little words to do so. And also, they're constantly reminded of their own foreignness. They're constantly trying to make sense of events, trying to connect it back to Washington so that it matters.
So they're rather to say, what's the local angle, as it were?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're under immense pressure, and they're aware, and they talk about it in the book of their own limitations, and there's something just inherent about it. It's not. I didn't speak with one journalist who basically said, "Oh, well, whatever, like it was mindless, didn't care at all about what the Afghans felt." They realized that it creates this tension, but the constraints within which they work really don't lead for another don't allow for another outcome.
So talk to us a little bit, if you can, about, so I was, one of the things that struck me about the book was the relative quickness with which, American broadcast journalism evacuated Afghanistan. Right? We're in year 18 of the war now, and after 2 years, basically broadcast outlets were largely out in terms of any permanent presence. Print stayed longer, continues to have a presence there, but it's really just a couple of outlets that still have a presence there. But there's this growth in Afghan journalism. Talk to us about that and the role that they play in all of this.
Great. Well, yeah, so I want to be fair to the broadcast journalists because there definitely were bureaus there. And there was ABC News, Nick Schifrin was there, there was CBS News, Laura Logan was very committed to the story, Afghanistan. There's Fox News. So there was, especially around the time of the civilian surge in the Obama era in 2009, there was an increase in broadcast news outlets. It was just that with print, there's still the print bureaus that remain there now. So there definitely were broadcast journalists who were there, just maybe not as consistent, or they had to cover multiple countries at once. But with the Afghan journalists, which I love talking about, this is really one of the best stories about Afghanistan the last 18 years that I don't think has really gotten enough attention. You have a remarkable cohort of Afghan journalists who really came of age during difficult times during the civil war in Afghanistan and then the Taliban years, and who suddenly in about 2001, 2002 were able to give a voice, to the Afghan people for the first time and to really build an independent journalism culture. It's been really difficult for them to do it, but they've flourished. And you have, I think, at the peak of it, you had more than 60 television stations. You had more than 150 radio stations. You had several print news outlets. It did change. It does reflect the power dynamics in the country. Not all the television stations are independent. Warlords have their own TV stations, right? You have TV stations that are backed by Iran or from Pakistan or India that kind of show the geopolitics of the region. So there is, if media reflects the society, then the Afghan media definitely does reflect what's going on there. But the Afghan journalists have really professionalized and grown. They've wanted to pursue a Western style of independent journalism. And you have stations like Tolo TV, One TV, Ariana, that are quite popular in the country and have created a lot of new norms and have really challenged the culture, conservative culture, almost at a breakneck speed in the country. So there is a very brave cohort of Afghan journalists who continue to report on the country and to make sure that Afghan news appeals to Afghans and that they're not just reliant on Western coverage to define their country.
This is good to hear, and I'm certainly learning something. You are now the president and CEO of Global Ties US. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
I love talking about Global Ties. So Global Ties US is the oldest and largest citizen diplomacy network in the United States. We are a partner of the State Department, and we help facilitate international exchange programs by making sure that when the world's best and brightest come to the United States, that they actually see the country. They don't just go to New York. They don't just go to LA. They go to Idaho. They go to Austin, Texas. They go to Montana. They go to Burlington, Vermont, where I'm headed tomorrow. And
this is a people-to-people.
It's a people-to-people.
Eisenhower era stuff,
exactly.
Right?
It's actually an 80. We help implement
Sounds great, doesn't
it? the international. Thank you. The International Visitor Leadership Program, and that's 80 years old as of next year. It was essentially a recognition by the U.S. government that if we are going to build a more peaceful, prosperous world, that our leaders and our people have to know one another. And so our network helps to run the programs, and it's just a privilege to be able to work with, more than 100 American nonprofit organizations that want to keep their doors open to the world.
And you're based in Washington?
We're based in D.C.
So here's some good news out of Washington.
That's it. So we've got 2 minutes left here. I want to come back to Afghanistan if we can. Mm-hmm. We're sort of at a perilous moment in terms of peace negotiations. Where do you think things are going to go in Afghanistan?
I'm staying hopeful. There's a long way to go, as I understand it, the way negotiations are right now. I think that, of course, the Taliban wants to negotiate just with the United States, and that's not going to work. Any kind of outcome needs to include the Afghan government as well. I think that the policy community, which is large for Afghanistan, if you think about it, more than almost 18 years of heavy U.S. involvement in the country means that you have a lot of Americans who've served there in some capacity, and what we all want peace. We want this conflict to end. At the same time, you want to make sure that human rights are upheld, and you have some vague statements like from Taliban leaders saying, don't worry that when they come out of this process that all Afghans will be treated well, but they're being pretty vague about human rights. And there's a concern, of course, that these hard-fought gains, especially in such a vibrant civil society that Afghanistan's developed, and such a vibrant press establishment that is developed, that will be harmed should the Taliban be able to come back.
What about the role of women?
And of course, yeah, absolutely, that is forefront of human rights. There's been considerable gains by Afghan women, not nearly enough though. And so what does that say about future progress, for them in society and their ability to pursue happiness, their ability to live openly? And this is something, that we all need to keep an eye on. We of course want peace, but it's complicated, and we want to make sure that human rights are upheld.
If you had to distill it down to a case of optimism or pessimism, 10 years from now, we're still going to be talking about a war in Afghanistan?
I think we'll be talking about Afghanistan through my lifetime, yes.
Wow. Wow. Well, Katherine Brown, the book is really quite the accomplishment. It's Your Country, Our War. Thank you so much for being with us. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's G. Wayne Miller. I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.